You begin with an assumption you rarely notice, that knowledge and truth stand side by side. You think that the more you understand, the closer you are to reality. Yet when you look carefully, you realize that this assumption has never been examined. It feels natural because it has been repeated, not because it has been proven. Al-Ghazali confronted this exact starting point. He questioned whether the mind, confident in its conclusions, ever pauses long enough to question the nature of its certainty. He observed that people often defend their ideas before they even verify them. You start to sense that the real question is not what you know, but how you came to believe that you know it. And if your certainty was inherited rather than discovered, what exactly are you trusting? Al-Ghazali lived in a world where arguments filled every corner of intellectual life. Philosophers debated the nature of existence. Theologians asserted doctrinal clarity. Mystics claimed direct perception. Every group declared its method final and reliable. Yet all of them depended on the same fragile instrument, the human mind. In the intellectual atmosphere of Baghdad, Al-Ghazali found brilliance, discipline, and ambition. But he also saw a deeper issue. None of these voices questioned the reliability of the very faculties they used to reach their conclusions. If every school claimed certainty, how could certainty itself be trusted? Al-Ghazali's crisis began when he realized that reason, experience, and tradition all assume their own validity. His doubt was not emotional but structural. He asked whether the tools through which the mind claims to know, logic, perception, memory, could guarantee truth to a mind capable of doubt. You reflect on this and notice something similar within yourself. You assume your senses report accurately until you remember how easily they mislead. You assume your reasoning is consistent until you find contradictory conclusions that both seem rational. So Al-Ghazali paused and reconsidered everything. Certainty, he discovered, must rest on something deeper than habit or confidence. But if the mind can question itself endlessly, where does questioning end? Reason, in Al-Ghazali's view, is essential but incomplete. It organizes, compares, infers, and predicts. Yet it cannot validate itself. Reason demands proof for everything except its own structure. It asks for justification but exempts itself from the same scrutiny. You begin to see the problem. Rational arguments can be sound, yet still built on assumptions that remain hidden. Logical clarity can exist even when the foundation is unexamined. You recognize that you often trust reasoning not because it is infallible, but because it feels familiar. Al-Ghazali concluded that reason is a tool, powerful but limited. It cannot cross the boundary of its own presuppositions. If reason cannot justify itself, how can it justify anything else? There is another challenge. The one observing the world is not neutral. The self that claims to seek truth is shaped by desire, fear, and preference. Even when you think you examine matters objectively, subtle inclinations shape your conclusions. Al-Ghazali insisted that the human mind bends evidence toward what it wants to believe. You begin to notice this in your own thinking. How easily you defend ideas that protect your identity, and how quickly you dismiss those that threaten it. You see how memories distort, how expectations color perception, how conclusions often arise first and justifications follow later. The mind becomes not just an instrument but an interpreter, one that filters what it sees through layers of conditioning. The witness is tangled with what it observes. The self that judges is affected by the outcome of its judgment. So the question deepens. You realize that understanding is not only limited by the capacity of reason but also distorted by the state of the one who reasons. If the observer is not reliable, how can the observation ever be pure? Al-Ghazali's thinking did not stop at questioning individual conclusions. He questioned the entire structure of certainty. He examined the senses and found them inconsistent. He examined reason and found it unable to validate its own foundation. He examined tradition and found it dependent on untested assumptions. As layers fell away, he discovered that the mind clings to familiarity as a substitute for truth. You begin to follow this unfolding within yourself. You see how sensory impressions can be convincing yet false. You see how rational arguments can contradict one another while each appears coherent. You see how beliefs inherited from family, culture, or education feel trustworthy simply because they have been unchallenged. This collapse is not destructive, it is clarifying. Al-Ghazali reached a point where the mind, stripped of its illusions, became incapable of claiming certainty based on external evidence. Only when every borrowed certainty dissolved did he face the essential question: what remains when all props are removed? You begin to sense that certainty cannot be built by accumulation. It must emerge from something that does not depend on arguments or impressions. If every foundation can be doubted, what is the nature of the ground beneath all knowing? At the height of his doubt, Al-Ghazali realized that the search for certainty in external sources could never succeed. He concluded that the only way forward was inward. Instead of examining objects of knowledge, he examined the capacity to know itself. You follow this inward shift. You pause and notice the movements of thought, how ideas appear, how judgments arise, how conclusions form. You begin to see that there is a distinction between the contents of the mind and the awareness that perceives them. Al-Ghazali discovered that while thoughts come and go, awareness remains stable. This shift changed his entire trajectory. He no longer asked, "What do I know?" but "What is the nature of the one who knows?" This inward turn does not add new information. It removes assumptions. It is not a process of acquiring but of clarifying. When the search turns inward, the mind loses its authority as the source of certainty and becomes transparent as an instrument. You begin to see that the clarity you seek may not depend on convincing arguments but on the refinement of the one who observes. If you stop trusting the products of thought, what becomes of the thinker behind them? Al-Ghazali's breakthrough came when he recognized a form of certainty that does not depend on argument. He discovered that awareness has a clarity that precedes interpretation. This clarity is immediate, not constructed. It does not analyze, it recognizes. You begin to sense this distinction within yourself. When you look at a thought, you notice that the awareness seeing it is not uncertain. Awareness does not question itself. It simply acknowledges what appears before it. It is the mind that doubts, compares, and argues, not the awareness that witnesses the mind. Al-Ghazali concluded that certainty rooted in awareness is different from certainty based on reasoning. Reason can be challenged. Awareness cannot be displaced, because it is the ground for all experience. This is not a mystical claim, it is an observation. Every thought you have appears within awareness. Every conclusion, every doubt, every insight, all of it is observed. As you continue to reflect, you see that real certainty emerges not when thought becomes perfect but when awareness becomes unobstructed. When the self's preferences and fears become quiet, awareness perceives without distortion. This form of knowing does not rely on external validation. It is not an opinion, not a belief, not an argument. It is the immediate recognition of what is present. In this sense, certainty becomes less about correctness and more about clarity. It arises from the state of the observer rather than the structure of the observation. If true certainty comes from awareness, then what role remains for the mind that tries so hard to understand? There comes a point in Al-Ghazali's inquiry where further argument no longer deepens understanding. He realized that reasoning, when pushed beyond its limits, creates more questions than answers. Every proof demands a prior proof. Every conclusion opens another branch of inquiry. You experience something similar when you try to think your way into certainty. The more you analyze, the more possibilities arise. The mind seeks closure, but reasoning expands the field of doubt instead of narrowing it. At some point, the thinker recognizes that thought has reached its boundary. For Al-Ghazali, this boundary was not an obstacle but a turning point. It revealed that some truths cannot be grasped by analysis because analysis functions through separation, dividing, comparing, categorizing. Awareness, however, sees directly without dividing. You begin to sense that inquiry, when carried to its limit, becomes quiet. The mind recognizes its limitations, and in recognizing them, it stops trying to occupy the place of truth. This recognition is not resignation but clarity. Inquiry ends not because answers are found, but because the need for answers dissolves. If thought cannot step beyond its own structure, what remains to be discovered when thought becomes silent? Al-Ghazali's journey ends not with a final answer but with a shift in understanding. He recognized that truth is not something the mind grasps but something that becomes evident when the mind stops insisting. Reason keeps its role as an instrument, but not as the ground of certainty. You begin to sense a quiet clarity. The search becomes still because the one who searched no longer demands possession of truth. Awareness does not claim anything. It simply recognizes what is present. In this silence, certainty is no longer an achievement. It is the natural state revealed when interference ends. When the one who seeks truth becomes silent, what remains but truth itself?